Troubleshooting vSphere environments. When things go wrong in our vSphere environment, we would want to determine what works and to what extent it works. We can then use this information to determine what doesn't work in our environment. Okay, so in this module, we're going to take a look at some troubleshooting tools that we can use on our ESXi host. Firstly, we have what VMware calls tech support mode. So this basically consists of using command line tools to monitor and troubleshoot our ESXi host. It's basically granting of shell and SSH access through the DCUI and through the security profile of our ESXi host, from where we could access other tools, including gathering of data for VMware support. So let's take a look at the vSphere web client and see where we could configure this. But before I get there, let me pull up my console or my DCUI, and we'll take a look at this first on the DCUI. Then we'll move over to the vSphere web client and see where we can configure this. So here I have one of my ESXi hosts up. So I'll just hit an F2 here. We would have looked at this previously, but very briefly. So let me just log in here. We'd want to enable access, SSH and shell access here. So under troubleshooting options, if I hit enter here, currently the shell is disabled and this is the default state. So once I hit an enter here, we could change that. Also SSH, once I hit an enter there, I could change that. And here I could adjust the DCUI timeout, idle timeout setting, so we could change this to 20 seconds, for example. Okay, so this is basically what we can do from the DCUI end to enable shell and SSH access. So let me just exit out of this here. Over on our vSphere web client, let me just pull up my vSphere web client here. Let me go over to home. And I'll go over to my host and cluster view. Let me just minimize that. So I have only one host in this inventory here. So if you go over to manage for this host, okay, and then come down in our list here under a security profile, okay, and then go over to the right and we'll scroll here, and then coming down towards the towards midway here, we have services. If we go under edit services, so this is where we could change the settings for those two services, the shell and SSH. So we could stop, we could restart. So basically you would want to have this up and running, and then you could set that's the status, and then you could set the startup type for this service. So shell and SSH access, you would want to ensure you have those two up and running for running of commands on your command line here. So let me just exit out of this here. So once this is enabled too, we can just double check on this. The firewall, we should have incoming connections now checked. So let me just go and edit on the firewall here. And here we see it. We have port 22 now open for incoming traffic. So that's basically it for tech support mode. Let's go over to some of the common issues we could monitor or troubleshoot in our environment. Let me just minimize this. So in this section, we'll take a look at some common issues we may need to troubleshoot in our vSphere infrastructure. Firstly, our boot device order. Um, we may need to reconfigure our boot configuration in our BIOS settings or change the boot selection menu when our host is booting. So although this step may seem simple, you would want or you'd want to take care to note that if you change the setting in the BIOS, it would also affect all subsequent boot of the server. So you may want to reconfigure the boot order once the ESXi is loaded onto our host. Since we're on BIOS settings, you would want to ensure too that your hardware virtualization features are turned on for your CPU for the host in your BIOS. Okay. Next, we can use the vSphere web client to manage the ESXi host hardware components. So here we can monitor fan speed, temperature, CPU, memory, network. We can monitor storage, batteries, among others. The number of components really that we can monitor here varies. This would depend on the various sensors that are available on the particular host. Generally, green indicator here would mean that all is working well. A yellow would show degraded performance with the component, and a red would mean a component has stopped working or has exceeded a threshold. So let's take a look at this, where we could monitor this in our infrastructure. So again, I'll pull up my vSphere web client. If I go over back to my host and cluster view, and let me just reload this. Okay, so I'm over to my host and cluster view. Select this host here. If I go to monitor, and then over on the right under hardware status, this is where we could monitor our sensors. So basically, I could just take a look at processor currently. These other options aren't showing up here because I'm virtualizing this ESXi host. But let's just assume this was running on physical hardware or on hardware, and we just install ESXi directly on top of that hardware. It would have access to all of those sensors. So then we could have monitor like our fan speed, voltages, temperatures, and stuff like that. There is a fair amount of stuff that we could monitor in this list here. We could also export the data. We could reset the sensor from here. Yeah, so this is basically it. We could see our alerts and warning for the hardware here too. So let me just minimize this back, and let's continue with our slides. Next, we would want to ensure we have a high uptime in our network. This would be even more important if we are utilizing some sort of IP storage like iSCSI or NFS. So to start with, we would need at least one interface connected to our management VM kernel port. That is one physical interface. So we need at least one of that connected to our management VM kernel port on our vSwitch. And this would be for management traffic. Ideally, you would want to configure more than one physical interface though for management traffic for redundancy purpose. Also, you'd want to ensure that you have a consistent port group naming on your port groups on your vSwitch. Okay. Furthermore, you'd want to ensure too that you have correct VLAN, correct security and TMIN options on your port group configured. Finally, for host networking, you would want to ensure that you have the correct duplex and speed settings between your VM NIC and the physical switch port on your physical switches. For networking from the virtual machine end, you'd want to ensure that you have the correct port group selected when we edit the VM settings. You'd want to double check that the VNIC in the VM is in a connected state also. If these settings are not correct, we may have problems with lack of connectivity. We may have problems with wrong security or traffic shaping settings, or incorrect NIC daemon issues. Okay, so let's take a look quickly where we can modify these settings here from the VM level. So I'll pull up back my vSphere web client. Let me just open this VM. This is just two VM I have in my inventory currently, so I'll just select one of them. If I was to right click this and then go to edit settings, okay, and then if I come to my network adapter here, I have the option here of choosing my VM kernel port group. So you'll just want to ensure that this VM, if you're having connectivity issues, you want to ensure that this VM is in the correct VM kernel port group here. Also, you'd want to ensure that this network adapter is connected. And obviously, if you have multiple network adapters, you will check the status for them. It's currently checked by default to connect at power on. You'll want to ensure you have the correct network adapter type 2. Okay, so let me just close this off. We would have looked at networking extensively, but let's just take a look back at your VLAN setting where you'd want your VLAN and naming setting for your port group, where you'd want those to be consistent on your different hosts. So let me go over there. We go over to our networking here. So over on host here, let's just go to our particular VM port group. So let's just select VM network here at the bottom and just edit this. So you'd want to ensure that this is consistently set across your different hosts, and also the correct VLAN ID is placed here. Okay, so let me just minimize this and let's continue here. Okay, for storage. If you're having storage contention issues, you'd want to take a look at your storage adapters that's connecting your connecting over to your remote storage devices. You'd want to ensure that you have your multi-pattern setup and that is configured correctly too. Another concern would be storage overcommitment issues. As we covered in the vSphere Advanced course, storage overcommitment is when our hosts and VMs are competing for the same storage resources. So you'd want to investigate the cause of this. It may include path trashing that cause your storage array to serve requests slowly. So path trashing generally occurs when two hosts are trying to access the same LAN over a different storage processor on the SAN. So to avoid this, you'd want to set up an active-active array where the host uses the same storage processor consistently on the SAN. Okay, and finally, once you are overcommitting your storage, you'd want to continuously monitor your storage system to ensure that you're not running out of storage capacity at the physical layer. So this is all I wanted to cover in this module. This was our final module for this course. So